Välkommen till Stolpes Stories, en podcast om litteratur och humaniora från Bokförlaget Stolpe. Vår värd för programmet heter Svante Tirén.
Thomas H. Mawson var en brittisk trädgårdsarkitekt och en av de mest inflytelserika rösterna inom det tidiga 1900-talets trädgårdsrörelse. Hans bok, The Art and Craft of Garden Making, kom ut i flera upplagor och blev nästan som en bibel för den tidens trädgårdsentusiaster. Mawson han förespråkade följsamhet med naturen, intima rum och en växtlig variation. Och faktiskt lever hans ideal och tankar kvar än idag. Nu har Bokförlaget Stolpe gjort ett nytryck av boken från 1926. I det här avsnittet så pratar vi med konsthistorikern Clive Aslet som är med på länk från England. Han ska förklara varför vi fortsätter att fascineras av Mawson och hans tankar om den levande trädgården. Very welcome, Clive.
Thank you.
Let's set the scene a little bit. I mean, today, especially here in Sweden, we associate England with gardening. I mean, it's emblematic for England, really. But if we look at the time of Mawson, Victorian times when he's born, is that the case then? Is gardening a huge phenomenon, or what's it like in the late 19th century?
Well, I don't think flower gardening had the kind of reach that it does now. Everybody in the country, every working person in the country had a garden, but it was to produce vegetables, and they would have had a few native flowers scattered amongst the vegetables to make them, to give beauty to the eye. But it was very important for gardens, for families to have these gardens, because that's what they put on the table. But I don't think there was the obsession with creating, for example, beautiful lawns, which became such a thing when I was growing up in the 20th century.
So it was a movement, but it hadn't yet reached this sort of huge sort of public interest in the way we see today.
No, great landowners like the Duke of Devonshire spent an absolute fortune on building glass houses, for example, and they had spectacular gardens. The great landscape architect of the 19th century was William Andrews Nesfield, and he was really the king of bedding out, as it was called. And so that meant that a lot of tender plants were grown under glass. They were very brightly coloured, and at different stages of the year they would be put out in great displays on parterres or terraces, so that they formed geometrical displays which subsequently would come to be regarded as rather gaudy.
Another feature here in Victorian times is, of course, that there are much more public parks emerging. I mean, not least because of urbanization and cities grow larger, and there are more parks accessible to the public now.
Yes, that was a phenomenon really from the beginning of the 19th century, where it was an expression of what we call the picturesque movement, which was again associated with landowners in the country, particularly because they were making their gentlemen's parks into things that were equivalent to the paintings of Claude Lorraine and the landscapes that they'd seen when they'd been on the Grand Tour in Italy. And that was a huge movement. Landowners spent a fortune on moving earth to make hills and to reshape the landscape, and planting thousands and thousands of trees, which of course they knew they would never see in their maturity. That was something they were leaving for their grandchildren. But it was a big, big debate. And this came into London when George IV, as Prince Regent, wanted to make some money by redeveloping some of his property, and he created Regent's Park, and a route from Regent's Park, which ended in St James's Park. So it went from one park to another. And those parks were publicly accessible, but they were really, if you like, created for a kind of gentlemanly or indeed princely aesthetic. Public parks as a movement were something more associated with the later part of the 19th century.
And it didn't perhaps spur people, going home and growing their own plants necessarily in that sense.
No, I think that people's interest in plants, most people, was kind of much more practical.
Now, Thomas H. Mawson, he was born in 1861 in Lancashire, and he had quite humble origins, let's say.
Yes, his family was nonconformist. It was deeply religious. His father had been, I think, something like a bricklayer, but then he had the idea that he would start a nursery, and Mawson had to help with his brothers, I think, in this nursery. But his father was not a very practical man. He wasn't a good businessman, and on top of everything, he then died when I think Mawson was about 12. So Mawson, at a very young age, had responsibility thrown on his shoulders. So he didn't have very much formal education, but he was determined to take the knowledge that he'd acquired from working in this nursery and to develop it and to make this his business, his career.
And it became quite successful. So eventually he could focus on garden design entirely, but he really started out as a sort of how should we say, an entrepreneur, a businessman? What's his sort of...
Yes, that's true. There were great nurseries developing, I think particularly in London, and he worked for these nurseries which were growing seeds for, largely it was a trade in seeds which could be sent around the country or indeed around the empire. So he worked for these nurseries, which enabled him to get a very profound knowledge of the plants that were available. But his interest was in that, but he saw a greater opportunity in design.
Considering how successful he became eventually, is his background unusual?
Well, we would tend to contrast it in this country with the career of Gertrude Jekyll, who was his contemporary, who these days I would say a better known, quite substantially better known gardener. Her work is very popular. She came from a different world. Her father had been an army officer. He had retired. They were very well connected, but not enormously rich. But she grew up in an intellectual atmosphere. Her parents had lots of intellectual and artistic friends. And she was a craftswoman. She was a member of the arts and crafts movement. She did lots of things. She had great craft skill herself, and she turned to gardening. Her eyesight started to go in her middle age, and she couldn't do this very fine embroidery that she'd been doing, so she turned to gardening. So she came from a different background, although it's interesting that her career had some parallels with Mawson. I think Mawson had to struggle in a different kind of way from Gertrude Jekyll. Of course, Gertrude Jekyll had the disadvantage in late Victorian society that she was a woman who was running a business, but she made her horticulture into a business because she was writing about it. She was photographing. She was a very early photographer. She was designing gardens. She also had her own nursery at her home in Surrey, Munstead Wood, which was supplying plants. She had a workshop in her house. She had a shop where she could sell plants directly to the public. And so, she had this whole business, which is also what Mawson did, but she came from a different background. Mawson's was a modest background, and he had little education, and he had to work his way up.
If we think about the 1880s, 1890s, just when Mawson emerges as this very successful landscape and garden designer, was there tons of, let's say, magazines and books on these topics, or what was the situation like in spreading knowledge about this?
Yes, I think that by the end of the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century, there was intense interest. There was a public for this, which I suppose crossed the classes probably. There were gardening clubs where Victorian working people were very interested to grow the best possible vegetables and things like that. But there were magazines, there were very successful ones edited by William Robinson, and he made money from publishing his magazines, but he was also a gardener, and he was a great proselytizer for the wild garden. He was taking a stance which was in opposition to all this bedding out, which was very artificial, and he thought that the beauties in nature were what should be brought into the garden. So I think I'm just trying to remember the name of his journal. I think it was actually The Garden. But also there was John Claudius Loudon. Loudon was slightly earlier than Robinson, more in the mid-Victorian period, but he was a bit less of a gardener than an encyclopedist. He made his living from writing, but he had to write just the most enormous number of books and magazines. But they were also focused on this question, on the broad question of how to design domestic life to give the most satisfaction.
So there was, if you were interested in this time, there was a lot of magazines and books. There were things to read about this, simply.
Absolutely. And the fact that there were these magazines shows that there was a public who was interested too.
If we go back to Mawson then, what's his style? I mean, when he makes his breakthrough here around the 1880s, 90s, what do they look like, his gardens? What characteristics are typical for Mawson?
Well, he worked with architects. One was called Mallows, there were various others, but there were two schools, really, which emerged at the end of the 19th century. One, which I mentioned, was William Robinson of the Wild Garden, but there were other people who were often architects. There's one called Sedding, there's one called Blomfield. They were interested in the setting of the house, that the house and the garden should be part of the same idea, if you like. And so they wanted greater formality in the way that gardens were organized, partly through architecture with terraces and balustrades and fountains and sundials, which were going to give structure, but also through the use of, for example, yew hedges, which could create a sequence of managed space, or kind of outdoor rooms, as I think we'd now call it. And Mawson was influenced by both these traditions, and I would say tried to achieve a sort of synthesis of gardens that had this structure, possibly stepping down to a lake or something like that, but also had elements of informality, not quite complete wilderness, as perhaps William Robinson might have advocated, but informality and a kind of more relaxed look.
So it's also a sort of a merge between the built and the grown architecture, let's say.
Yes, it's a marriage of the two.
As a parallel, of course, we have the whole arts and crafts movement, which, of course, celebrates, the handmade before the machine made, and a whole design aesthetic philosophy and so on. What's Mawson's relationship to this? Is he part of the arts and crafts movement?
Yes, there were different kind of gradations to the arts and crafts movement. There were some people who were very extreme and, for example, thought that things could only be built of the actual building materials you found on the site. Of course, that was extremely limiting, and they didn't necessarily make a big success. But there were others who more broadly subscribed to the principles. I think that Edwin Lutyens, with whom Gertrude Jekyll worked in a famous collaboration, I think that he was more on that side. He liked, it was an idea, but it was an idea which you didn't have to apply with kind of religious zealotry. And I think Mawson was the same, that he broadly subscribed, but he wasn't on the extreme wing.
So there is a relationship, but he has his own way of interpreting this.
Yes.
and being part of it.
Yes.
Now, of course, his commissions are becoming grander and grander. He becomes a very successful person. There are fantastic gardens still preserved today, as we mentioned, you can see. But what about his writing career? When does he decide that he wants to write an instruction about this?
Well, writing was important, and the publication was important in the late 19th century. Jekyll and Lutyens were particularly associated with the magazine Country Life, that had one view of architecture, and it published masses. This was a great time for English domestic architecture. It was admired throughout Europe, really, because Britain was a rich country which had a long and stable tradition. It hadn't been invaded very much or fought over for a long time. And so domestic life was thought to have evolved to a high peak, both in terms of the house and the garden. So country life had one view, but there was an international interest in what was happening in Britain, which was satisfied more by publications such as The Studio, which had a broader European distribution. And that was something to which Mawson attached himself. He was keen to encourage greater knowledge of his gardens, and he wrote The Art and Craft of Garden Making, the wonderful facsimile that Stolpe has done, which is a most beautiful book in terms of publishing today, just as it was a beautiful book when it was first published in 1926. That was the 5th edition, so he had been working on this since way before the First World War. I can't remember when the first edition came out. I think, was it about 1900?
Yes, the one that he himself financed in the year 1900. That's the first one.
Well, yes, of course, that was an example too, which you remind me that he actually he put his own money into it. He was somebody who was rather on the outside. As I say, these other gardeners, typified by, or at least Gertrude Jekyll herself, she had to work very hard. She had the obstacle of being a woman in what was, in a sense, a man's world, because everybody working in the garden, all the head gardeners, they were all men. But she had more connections in publishing and didn't have to finance these things herself, whereas Mawson did. So he was struggling, battling all the time.
Mm. Let's get into then the art and craft of garden making. I mean, it is a full book describing virtually all parts, really, of creating a garden and so on. But what's the main concept here? How can we compare this book compared to other books on gardening during this time?
Well, I think that Mawson was trying to make his subject accessible, and he was publishing all sorts of ideas, really. And these were ideas really for the middle classes. A lot of them were ideas which involved objects as a focus of composition, a sundial or something like that. Indeed, embossed on the cover, I think, is a sundial. Well, a working person couldn't have afforded a beautifully crafted sundial like that, but it wasn't beyond the reach of really this new middle class, which was very comfortably off possibly from investments or there was a new type of house which was described in country life as being the small country house. We wouldn't necessarily think of them as being that small today. We would think of them as being rather larger than average. But by the standards of the Edwardian age, when people were still building very large country houses on landed estates, these were regarded as small. And these were houses that were bought or commissioned by successful lawyers, people who owned chains of grocery stores, people who had come back perhaps from successful careers in the empire. There was a new public who could afford these quite large houses by our standards, and not a great landed estate, but say what we would regard as a very substantial garden of, 10 acres or more, perhaps. And so this was a public that Mawson was interested in.
So there was really a new, let's say, target group with this growing middle class, and they had time and money simply to do gardening and do it in this new way.
Yes, not necessarily themselves. Of course, they employed other people mostly to do it.
They had helping hands, let's say.
They had helping hands.
But again, is it the same idea in this book? Is it a more relaxed, informal garden, or is it more prestigious? What is the tone of these gardens that Mawson is advocating?
Well, I think that gardens were seen as being part of a unit with the house. The house and the garden should be in harmony with each other. And medicine was discovering that being in the fresh air was a good thing for diseases which were terrifying for Victorians, such as tuberculosis. So there was an emphasis on spaces which were neither quite in the house nor quite in the garden. So loggias and sheltered places where you could sit. There were gardens where you could linger and you could spend more time outside, and they were carefully constructed for the dynamics of turn-of-the-century house parties, where houses would be full of guests but organised in an informal kind of way with something for everybody to do throughout the day, and where people would kind of wander off and break up into groups where they would have conversations. Typically, this is what was always happening in the novels of Henry James. People could have these intense conversations in places which were not completely secret, because that would have been improper, but places that weren't overheard by other people. And that's the sort of world that Mawson is gardening for.
So if we compare to some Victorian gardens, which are sometimes highly ornamental and more sort of representative in their tone, this is much more about an interactive and welcoming garden for more, let's say, informal interaction, or yes?
Yes, I would say that is absolutely true. And also there's a sort of strong aesthetic about it, that mid-Victorian gardens were highly regimented. And that's what people wanted to see, the control. It was like a kind of military operation, really. Whereas the aesthetic that developed by 1900 was that it was more poetic, to see gardens which looked as they were just on the point as though nature might have been able to take over. Of course, that didn't happen. It was all artifice, really, because there were gardeners who would stop nature taking over. But they wanted to see plants growing in a freer way, which expressed their natural habit, if you like.
Were they conceived as very modern at this time? Was style, this approach to gardening, was that modern, or was it just seen as something quite classical?
Well, I think that there was a kind of paradox that the old-fashioned was regarded as modern. People were looking to the gardens of the past, what they might have called the old English garden. That, curiously, was modern. So it wasn't. When we use the word modern, we tend to think of things that are very hard-edged and a machine aesthetic. There was nothing like that in a Mawson garden. That wouldn't have been what he liked at all. But they were modern in the sense of introducing new ideas to the Edwardian age.
Mm. And finally, today, if we want to experience a typical Mawson garden, where do we go?
Well, Rydal Hall in the Lake District is a very good example. The Lake District is also where Mawson began his career. He was very much associated with the north of England rather than Jekyll and Hutchins, whom I've been mentioning, who were in what we call the home counties around London. So it's a particularly appropriate one from point of view of its location in a beautiful setting, which is looking out over the natural landscape, but kind of punctuated or articulated, I should say, with urns and balustrades and other built forms to give kind of structure. That's a wonderful Mawson garden, which is beautifully presented. But in a way, Mawson's legacy wasn't just about private gardens. He was very early and had an extraordinary career in the creation of parks and also the gardening of complete communities, landscape architecture, really. He had a great patron in this country, in Lord Leverhulme, who had been W.H. Lever, who'd originally made his fortune from making soap, and he was a very progressive and interesting man. He later had plantations to grow the palm oil that he used in his soap, which came from Africa. And he had a great fortune. He was enormously interested in architecture. He was almost neurotic in the way that he would have building projects that were on the go all the time. But he also had a very enlightened philanthropic attitude towards the importance of architecture for his workforce, for example, that Port Sunlight, and wanted to give benefit to working people in places that he was associated with. And so a very good park that exists today, in fact, is called Leverhulme Park these days, outside Bolton, which I think was where Leverhulme came from. But that's a good example of the public architecture that, or public gardening that Mawson did, which he did very much of, not only in this country, but in Canada and many other countries too. So his footprint is very large, if you like.
There was just something about him that translated very well into different countries and different parts of the world even.
Yes, I think he had this. I think perhaps the most important idea of Mawson's was that while he had begun gardening for rich people who lived in country houses, he felt that the qualities that they were enjoying could be amplified for urban people in many different places really around the world. And in that, I think that he was really new.
And now, of course, his legacy continues with the new edition of this book called The Art and Craft of Garden Making. Thank you so much for joining us, Clive.
Thank you very much.
Tack för att du har lyssnat på Stolpes Stories. Missa inte att du som lyssnar har 20% rabatt på Bokförlaget Stolpes titlar hos Bokus.se. Aktivera rabatten genom att ange koden STOLPE20. Och för att lyssna på fler avsnitt, följ oss där poddar finns och på sociala medier.